On a couple of the upcoming activities, tomorrow there's a tour of the Lombard Avenue area at 6:30. And then on Wednesday, we have a special tour of the Washington Avenue Historic District. And that will be at 6 o'clock, and we'll kick off from Patchwork Central. And the nice thing about this tour is we have a new brochure that will be premiered at that tour. It's a brochure on architectural styles in the Washington Avenue Historic District. And this tour features sketches by one of the residents, Billy Heddle. And it's a nice combination of art, architecture, and history. So I hope you can come. And I know that this program this evening is going to be very enjoyable. And I hope to see you at some of the other Preservation Month activities. And here is Matthew Rao, the Executive Director of the Reitz Home.
Thank you for coming to the Reitz Home this evening for Gayle Cook's lecture, The Mystique of Domes. Gayle Cook and her late husband Bill are renowned across the state for their monumental historic preservation efforts at West Baden, Gentryville's Colonel William Jones House, and most recently, the new Indiana Landmark Center in Indianapolis. You know, Gayle is an Evansville native. She went to Bosse High School, she told me today. She's a member of the Reitz Home, and I'm just so pleased that it worked out for her to be here this evening. She's going to begin by talking about she and her late husband's interest in domes and how that led them to their work at West Baden and other prospects for restoring Indiana domes. Here's Gayle Cook.
Thank you, Matt. This dome journey is going to start in Bloomington, Indiana, where I live, and then it will skip around the state and around the United States and the world. This is my starter dome in Bloomington. When I moved there in 1963, you could not go inside the courthouse and look up at the dome because in one of the many renovations, they had extended each floor across the rotunda. So when you looked up inside the courthouse, you just saw a ceiling. So almost no one knew what the dome looked like unless you had jury duty, which I did in 1973. Because after they had put all the floors across the rotunda, they had created a little superior courtroom right under the dome. This is a slide taken while it was a courtroom. You can see the murals, the stained glass up above, and down below, the flags and the lamps on each end of the judge's bench. Then in the 80s and late 70s, there was another surge to renovate the courthouse or even to tear it down. And so Bloomington Restorations, the local preservation group, started a campaign to save it. And they had a bond drive, which passed, so they had a bond issue to do this with, and immediately started repairing the dome, which needed emergency help. And 3 of us ladies, literally in tennis shoes, were allowed to photograph and climb the dome, a once-in-a-lifetime experience because of the successful push to preserve it. And that's one of the ladies waving from the weather vane at the top. So the courthouse was renovated and the dome was cleaned up, except that the murals were not restored that you're going to see, but the stained glass and the rotunda was opened, and even the bell was reactivated. The bell had been silent for 22 years. That's how long the rotunda was closed, because the bell was right over the judge's bench. In that renovation, it revealed another dome over Circuit Court. This is a much smaller one, but that one someone had covered over completely too. In this process of renovating, they removed the enormous hand-painted murals at the top of the rotunda, the dome. And this slide shows a crew from the IU Art Museum rolling out these huge canvases with paintings on them to put them into storage because the bond issue didn't cover the murals. So they went into storage, and it's going to be 9 more years before they see the light of day. This is what was underneath the murals, mold and dampness, and a look at the surface of the paint. And this is a good part. Many of the parts had been taped together and painted over, but we saw the beauty of it. They're 16 feet long, 4 of them, 8 feet high, and leave a big blank in the dome when they aren't there. So the commissioners appointed a Citizens Building and Grounds Committee. If any of you are in politics, you know that what you do on the courthouse lawn gets very touchy. And so they appointed a Citizens Committee so that we could make decisions. And the first thing that we did was make repairs. People don't realize that all these monuments, we had 11 monuments on the lawn. They are an expense for upkeep, and sometimes they're dangerous, and sometimes they're in poor artistic taste. But so we did our duty, and we advised a moratorium on any more memorials. In the meantime, we made a repair. The left arm on the sculpture group on the courthouse had been broken off for years. That was repaired. The arm of the peace statue that held a dove was broken off, and we replaced that. And last fall, saw in the paper that it was broken again. Someone was climbing on it. The Fighting Yank was meant to forever carry a grenade in that extended hand, but for many years he carried a nicely molded concrete basketball. And that had to be removed. In the meantime, the murals were somewhere languishing in storage. And by one of those great coincidences, at that time, we bought an surplus school, the Brown School that's north of Bloomington, across from the winery. And when we were inspecting the school, which was going to be the headquarters for the Star of Indiana Drum and Bugle Corps, where they rehearse when they're not on tour, and someone came up and said, "What in the world are those big tubes in the gymnasium?" So I went to look and saw at the end, it said, "Caution, caution, this must be stored at temperatures between 55 and 75 degrees and 45 and 55 relative humidity." And I realized I was looking at the murals pulled up. They were not exactly experiencing the right environment. So we then sent them to the IU Art Museum for archival storage, where they had languished for more years, until our committee raised the money and made the effort to restore them. So we were looking around for an organization, a a company that could restore 4 16-foot murals. I had seen the ads for the Conrad Schmidt Company in the National Trust magazine, and had seen these incredible pictures of what they had done. This is a theater in Boston that the Conrad Schmidt Company had renovated, done the interior decoration for. This is the Basilica of St. Joseph's, which the same company did the interior restoration of, and another view of a dome there. The same company did restoration work on the Notre Dame campus. This is the Basilica of the Sacred Heart on the left on the Notre Dame campus, which they restored inside. And on the right is the famous Golden Dome, which they worked on also inside. And it looks like this. And that's an example of trompe-l'oeil, and the top of the dome, it's painted to look like sky, but it isn't, it's just paint. Also on the Notre Dame campus, they had restored the giant mosaic on the end of the building that overlooks the football field. It's 137 feet high. You can see the hanging scaffolding where they're doing the work on the mosaic. And you probably know this is known as Touchdown Jesus. Then I went to visit the Conrad Schmidt Studios. It's an enormous company. They not only do paintings like our murals and mosaic, but they do stained glass, plaster work, sculpture, anything that's needed. So we hired them. We sent our murals to Milwaukee, and they came back and were installed. They had been out of the public eye for 31 years.
Wow.
They commemorate features of Monroe County, in this case, knowledge and education. Well, while we were doing that, there was another building that needed help in southern Indiana. Was Baden Springs Hotel. This is an old picture, and this is a picture from today. When it was built in 1901 and 2, it was the largest dome in the world. When we saw it for the first time, thinking of renovating it, it looked like this inside. The big atrium under the dome is 200 feet in diameter. It had been vacant for 13 years. As some of you may know, it closed as a hotel in 1932 in the Depression, was a Jesuit seminary for 30 years, and then Northwood College for 16 years, and then empty for 13. The exterior looked like this when we surveyed our next project. 6 floors of guest rooms, not the dome, had pancaked and fallen to the ground. Well, we called on Conrad Schmidt, and they journeyed to Indiana once again, did their magic inside the dome and elsewhere. Back up. The paintings on the ceiling are painted on canvas, and they're very much like an oil painting. Each of those squares or rectangles has a wooden frame and a stretched canvas, and is hand painted. All those that you see in the ceiling. The 24 columns that hold up the dome have garlands of flowers painted on each side, and Conrad Schmidt estimates they painted 3 miles of garlands in this job. This is an illustration that shows, I think, how someone was overcome by the mystique of domes, because this is a fantasy picture of West Baden. West Baden has 6 floors. and this has 7. West Baden has 4 towers, and this picture has 8. It never had an onion on top of the dome. And there's even a train creeping across the grass here where there was never a track. So this was, I assume, an advertising piece. We don't know its origin, but it's a great picture of perpetuating the mystique of this building. Well, West Baden remained the largest dome in the world until the great athletic domes built in the 1960s. This is the Houston Astrodome. It's 710 feet across. The largest dome in the world now is also an athletic dome in Japan, the Oita Dome, and it's 891 feet across. But domes have been around a long time. The Romans, 2,000 years ago, built the Pantheon, and it's still standing. You can go see it. 1,000 years ago, they were building the great mosques in the Middle East. And about 500 years ago, the large domed cathedrals in Europe were being built. This is the Duomo in Florence. This is a cover of a book, Brunelleschi's Dome. He was the architect, which is a good story about building domes. It wasn't very easy in those days. This church, up to this point, was 170 feet high, and then the dome rises even more. So the architect had to design not only a dome that would stand up, but a method of getting people and building materials to those great heights without snorkel lifts, without helicopters, without elevators, without power tools. And so part of the architect's job was designing this mechanism simply to get materials up and build the dome. This is the Royal Albert Hall in London. It's a concert hall. Some of you may have seen if you've been to London. It is just about the size of West Baden, except it's slightly elliptical. There are acoustical problems in some domes, like West Baden. A lot of echoes. It's hard to have good music presentation, speakers there, without taking some effort to dampen the echoes. And we had heard that the Royal Albert Hall had solved the problem by making changes to the ceiling. So one time when I was in London, I went to see the Royal Albert Hall to see just what they had done, because it was so much like West Baden inside. So when I went in, I asked for seats in the highest balcony, in the highest row. And the woman said, no, we have much better seats than that. And I explained to her that I just was there to see the ceiling. What they have done is suspend what look like upside down mushrooms all across the ceiling. Giant discs hanging, touching each other, and just like this all across the ceiling. Well, we decided that was not a solution for our beautiful dome, so what we do is hang draping around the first 2 floors of the atrium. You can rent these enormous black drapes. You know, if you've been to an arena where they close off part of it for a rock concert or something, they drape these large black drapes across. So that's what we do when we really want to adjust the acoustics. What you may know about domes, sometimes children's blocks have examples of this. When you build an arch, and a dome is just a circle of arches, you build an arch, when it would start curving at the top, the pieces would fall down. So usually when you build an arch, you build a temporary framework inside. And then when you add that last keystone, it will support itself. Domes also have something called an outward thrust. Not only is that weight coming down from the top, but it's then forcing the bottom of the dome outward. This is illustrated by this drawing. You can imagine that these are the ribs of a basket, and when a weight comes down the center, those ribs of the basket would splay outward, unless there's a band around it. So domes, in one way or another, all have a support at the bottom of the dome to keep it from falling. St. Peter's is said to have a giant chain embedded in the masonry and contain that outward thrust. The Duomo in Florence, which you saw a picture of, has a row of stones held together with iron clamps. Modern domes have a band of steel, like the U.S. Capitol, the Royal Albert Hall, and Westgate. The Pantheon, which was built 2,000 years ago, contained that outward thrust with sheer masonry. These walls at the bottom of the dome are 18 feet thick. The domes in Istanbul pass that outward thrust to a smaller dome, then a smaller dome, until it dissipates. We're fortunate to have photos of the building of the West Baden Dome, which was 1901 and 2. In this picture, the guest rooms are being built. There are 2 rooms of guest rooms and a hallway around the dome in the center. In this picture, you see the ribs of the dome being placed. And in the center is a tower to hold up the center, a temporary tower, crane on the top. And this is a view of the tower inside that is holding it up like the keystone in the center until all the ribs are in place. And here it is with that center removed. The story goes that Harrison Albright, the architect, stood on top when they removed that inner tower to show his confidence in his design. This is a picture of the inside of the dome. There's no roof on it yet, but the ribs are in place, and you can see the hub that holds together the steel ribs. Inside this hub, which is 16 feet in diameter, there is a mystery or surprise. There are 11 larger than life-size angels painted on the interior of this steel drum. We don't know who painted them, we don't know why or when. They are copies of Fra Angelical angels that you can see in museums in Italy. The angels are playing different music instruments. The first guess is that the Jesuits painted them. They were there for 30 years. But if you look closely, you'll see that the graffiti on the angels predates the Jesuits by several decades. So that's not the answer. You can't see the angels, they're inaccessible. and our insurance company does not encourage visitors to see them. The way to see the angels is you go up and out on the flat roof that covers the guest rooms. Then you take this ladder up the outside of the dome. Then you go inside the cupola at the top of the dome, through a trap door, and then you're in that room. I have a woman researching this, trying to find out who painted the angels. The problem is that anyone who was alive when the angels were painted is no longer living. So we have to depend upon records or hand-me-down knowledge. This shows where one of those ribs rests on top of one of the 24 columns. And there's something interesting about this in that this is a movable joint because of the enormous ribs. There is a little change of expansion and contraction with temperatures. So this joint is made to move. You can also see in this slide the steel band that goes around the top of the columns, the bottom of the dome. This is the scaffolding that I climbed to take that picture. The scaffolding inside the dome was a fantastic sight to see. Not only the big dome, but this huge scaffolding. It, in fact, made the covers of a couple of construction magazines. You can't have acrophobia to climb a scaffolding. And I don't, so that's how I went up the scaffolding until I was above the column top. Someone who did not have acrophobia was the resident raccoon. These are raccoon tracks on the top of freshly painted beams at the top of the dome. The building had been unused for 13 years, and we had several kinds of wildlife inside the building that had to be relocated, and the raccoon was one. If you've been to West Baden, you know there isn't just one dome, there are two. This is the little dome. It's just 100 feet in diameter. This is actually the lobby, and you go through it and then into the big dome. In this picture, you can see the double doors that surround the lobby dome. These were filled with stained glass because this room was the sanctuary when the Jesuits had their seminary there. This is a close-up of each of those double doors with a lunette window at the top. Not long before we got involved in the project with Indiana Landmarks, we're actually the owners of the building then. All 8 of these lunette windows were neatly, professionally stolen. And so when we did the restoration, we were using clear glass and began filling them in, and increased the security so that they didn't come back and take the double doors below. And then one day, one of the tour guides who worked at West Baden, it was open for tours long before it was finished as a hotel again. He was in an antique store in Louisville and found 4 of the lunette windows. So we brought them back, and then Sue Morrison, who has Sunburst Glass in Newburgh, duplicated and made 4 more. And you can't tell the difference. Well, while we were doing that, there were some ladies in southern Indiana who also had a dome that needed work, and that is, as many of you know, the Benedictine sisters at the Monastery of the Immaculate Conception in Ferdinand. And they had a campaign going to renovate their sanctuary. And they also had an impressive scaffolding installation that made the cover of their magazine called The Dome. So Conrad Schmidt, once again, we were not involved in the work on this. They had their own contractors. But Conrad Schmidt came down from Milwaukee and once again decorated the interior of their sanctuary at Ferdinand. And this is the way it looks today. When they dedicated this, rededicated it, when the renovation was done in 2005, I went to the dedication mass, which was memorable because they had raised, just for this themselves, $7 million. And the generous donors were there celebrating, and it had such significance for them. It was memorable, but also for the fact that the brand new smoke detectors went off during the mass. Needed a little adjustment. The latest dome that we worked on was the former Central Avenue Methodist Church in Indianapolis. This is now the headquarters of Indiana Landmarks Foundation, and the head of the headquarters is over here, Marsh Davis. This is familiar to Marsh. It's where he works. It's now an events center. It can still be used for weddings, beautiful weddings, but also conferences, meetings, concerts. Before any work was done, before we got involved in it, and Indiana Landmarks, we had musicians come and play in the sanctuary. Then we moved over into their domed theater and had the musicians play to see if the acoustics were good enough to turn this into an event center. Because if they had been bad, it would have been a great handicap. But they were very good. And also renovated in this was the organ. Conrad Schmidt came, did all the repainting, fancy work. The organ pipes even had hand-painted flowers on them originally, and they duplicated the flowers on the organ pipes. Also, once again, Sue Morrison of Sunburst Glass renovated the windows. So this is up and running. If you need a venue in Indianapolis, see Marsh, and it's just really a very nice place. The old office part of the church complex is Indiana Landmarks headquarters. This is the latest building that needs help for a dome. This is a library, an old library on the Indiana State University campus in Terre Haute. They are renovating this classic building, and someone alerted the president to the fact that it once had a beautiful dome. The dome was over the central reading room. You see here the reading room, back here the book stacks, and you see the curve. This was once a huge stained glass dome, which had been covered over. And just about a month or so ago, I don't know, is Tommy Kleckner here by any chance? Well, he's the Indiana Landmarks representative in Terre Haute, and he took some of these pictures. This is the dome as it is now. They decided to renovate it. If any of you are ISU alums, I would expect a mailing inviting you to donate. The renovation of the building is taken care of with university funds, normal university funds, but that did not include renovation of this beautiful stained glass dome. This is the only picture I have of the dome as it was, and it's black and white. But this is a panel from the glass. The great scholars of the past are memorialized in panels all the way around the dome. And 4 of them were kept and on display through the years when the dome was gone. And when they began looking into the renovation, this is what they found in the attic. All the glass from the dome thrown on the floor of the attic. Some in good shape, some not. That's good news and bad news. Good news because the actual glass is there, the colors can be replicated, some of the glass can be used, but a lot of it is broken. But the evidence is there for a total restoration. Indiana State University has not 1, but 2 domes. This is one that exists at ISU. It's smaller than the one they're restoring and has never been taken down. So if you ever go there and you look at domes, you can see the other one. This one also honors famous literary people and others. I see Shakespeare and Edgar Allan Poe and so on. So people just had totally forgotten there was a bigger and more beautiful dome at ISU. So someday there will be another one there. And this you recognize as your own fantastic old courthouse with a beautiful dome. I can't remember being in it, and if you haven't been in it for a long time, here's what it looks like inside. And it's very nice. Take a look. And there are really 2 other domes. There are side domes there also that you can have a rotunda you can look up in. Well, this is a last glimpse as we wind down here of the West Baden Dome that is 200 feet in diameter. And this is probably the most famous dome, St. Peter's Dome Church. This is St. Peter's in Rome. This is the familiar piazza. The church is cruciform, which means it's in the shape of a cross. This is a long nave, then the transept here, topped by a big, beautiful dome. This dome took over 100 years to build. Michelangelo, Bernini, several Piedramonti worked on this dome, and each one had to figure out the architectural problems and that we talked about with the Duomo. But finally, it was finished and is probably the best known one. Now, this will remind you of St. Peter's. Here's the piazza. Here's the cruciform church with a long nave, a transept. But look what's happened to the dome. It's huge. This is now the largest domed church in the world. But you will notice that there are no tourists strolling in the piazza. There are no cars on the road. Little signs of civilization over here. Because this huge dome is in the town of Yamoussoukro in the Ivory Coast in Africa. I know of only 2 people who have seen it. It was built by the president of the country and of course cost a lot of money. It was consecrated by the Pope in 1990. And as you may know, there's been a civil war in the Ivory Coast for years. Supposedly the Pope said, I don't know whether this is true, but when he consecrated this church for a country that has very few Catholics, he said, next time, why don't you build a hospital? But any case, it's quite spectacular. You can go online and see other views of it, but never quite the ones that I want of the big dome and the expanse. So this is the last slide. If any of you ever go there, send me some pictures. Thank you very much.